It's ad break time. I'm proud to announce that Beyond Solitaire podcast is sponsored by Central Michigan University's Center for Learning Through Games and Simulations. And as usual, they're up to some amazing things. Their next game, Hydrologic Cycle, is scheduled to come to Kickstarter on March 26th. CLGS also continues to offer classes in partnership with Gen Con. The next course, Jason Fury's Crowdfunding with Confidence, starts May 6th and will teach you all about board games and crowdfunding. Go check it out. Also, I'll include a final plug for myself. If you like the show and want to support it, you can do so by going to patreon.com/beyondsolitaire. Thanks to listeners like you, I've been able to keep upgrading my equipment, subscribing to StreamYard, and more. But for now, let's get on with the show. Hey, gamers, it's Liz Davidson from Beyond Solitaire, and I'm here on the pod this week with a very special guest. This is Weyodi OldBear. She is a writer and Indigenous futurist, and she's on here to talk about writing in general and about work on a tabletop RPG. So how you doing, Weyodi?
I'm great. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, I'm super happy to have you on. So you mentioned, we were talking in the pre-chat about how you are an Indigenous futurist. For people who do not know what that is, what is the nutshell version?
Well, the nutshell version is someone who looks forward to Indigenous future rather than treating it like treating being Native like a LARP, like we're members of the Society for Creative Anachronists, only Native version. Sometimes there's a problem where people, and it gets onto natives, but it's usually a white problem of seeing being Native as the SCA for natives. Like we all have to be reenacting the 1870s in order to be authentically Native. But instead, it's about being authentically Native in the future. I mean, my oldest child is an engineer at Intel, so we're in the future. We're not timepieces. I'm terrible at nutshells.
No, it's all good. We'll get there. I also am just like, I always admire professional writers. How did you become a writer? How long have you been writing? What kind of led you down the path?
Well, how I became a writer is when I was in kindergarten, I came home I lived with my grandparents. It's very common among Native people to be raised by your grandparents. I was raised by my grandparents. My great-grandmother was in the home. And I came home from kindergarten all happily talking about Indians. And I had no idea the teacher had been talking about us. It was the Thanksgiving Day lesson,
Oh, yeah.
Pocahontas and all that stuff. And I had no idea that they were talking about that had anything to do with me or my family. And so I went on and I came home. I've always been an extremely chatty person. I came home and told everybody what I'd learned at school that day. And they sat me down and they said, she was talking about us. And I was like, no, she wasn't. That's not us. And it took me a little bit to believe it. And I had never heard, we never called ourselves Indians. We called ourselves Comanches or Numina. That's what we call our name for ourselves. And so I was shocked and dismayed. And I said, well, when I grow up, I'm going to write the real version. I'm going to write about how we really are. And they said, no one will ever listen to you. No one, they don't want to hear it. They don't want to hear our version. And they don't want to know what we're really like. And I said, well, I'll make them listen. Is what I told my grandmother. And she said, okay, you go ahead and try. And And I spent a long time trying and not having the world listen. And then there was an explosion of just my variety. I mean, I really became interested in Indigenous futurism when I realized that writing the true version of history as as it has come down through our oral history, as it is told through us, even our culture, their publishers aren't interested in hearing, or weren't for a very long time, and to my knowledge still are resistant to a native version of native history. So I started writing native futurism, native science fiction, that really, that by projecting us into the future, projecting our culture, baby doll, grandchildren,
You know.
so that I could sneak in our real culture and real history by writing science fiction.
Oh, that's
And
wild.
then I still had it was still hard. And then, but in the 2010s, there suddenly became a market for, some interest in it. And then in, and Coyote Crow came about when everybody else says Coyote. Connor, the founder, says Coyote. I just don't say it like that. But I saw on the Indigenous Futurism's Facebook page that he was looking for Indigenous gamers and writers who were interested in developing this game, literally a week after the beginning of the pandemic. I
Oh
mean,
wow.
it was March of 2020. And he said, "Well, I want to do this thing." And I'm like, "Well, I obviously have nothing else going on." So I signed up and got involved. Um, I wrote the city, um, planned out the city and the businesses and all that business. And I wrote also the cultures of the free lands, some of the obstacles, but the cultures of the free lands were my main focus in the game. I don't know if you've read the book.
I have. Yes, actually. So just to make sure everybody listening is on with us, I invited Weyodi on here because she contributed to a tabletop RPG called Coyote and Crow, that is set in a future where colonialism never happened and where indigenous cultures were able to develop freely and unimpeded by Europeans.
Well, and it's kind of interesting because the very first thing is Connor called me, and I was like, "Give me a call. Let's talk in person, or in real time." He called me, and I had been working on some alternate histories where colonialism never happened. And he was like, "Well, I have this idea for this game where colonialism never happened." And I was like, "Wow, I've been doing this." And so we really meshed on that, because it doesn't mean a development without obstacles and without catastrophe and trauma. It's just not, it's just a different pressures, you know, because
Yeah.
all human civilizations have weird stuff happen, so there's always it's always something,
Well, in Coyote and Crow, if I recall correctly, basically the European colonial um, movement is stopped by a climate event that impacts the planet, and so basically we all stay put,
yeah, a
and
meteor a
and that
meteor comes down, that causes the climate shift, the violent climate catastrophe that sort of freezes everyone in place, literally.
So, who came up with that concept? And
That's Connor. That was
nice.
Connor. He was like, "This is my idea," and he's like, "And this is why." And he's like, "We wouldn't." And I said, "Well, very first thing I jumped in with was we wouldn't under that circumstance be in the tribes that we are now necessarily, because different pressures would cause people to break apart, come together, amalgamation of nations, breaking apart of nations. I mean, if you look at Europe in the 1300s, they weren't Europe as they are today.
That is
You
very
know,
true.
those nations didn't exist. So it's like that. It's that sort of a thing, and we kind of riffed from there. Um, so one of our big conflicts, interestingly, that Connor and I had, this was about plumbing, which you might not imagine that this is a thing that two people are going to argue about, because he has the bacteria eating the waste from the city, because it's a huge city, and he has this. And I wanted them to use their waste and make pray to terre like the people do in the Amazon, or did in the Amazon. And so we had, I think that's the most heated disagreement we had about. He was like, "But I already wrote this and I really like it and it really works." And I'm like, "Yes, but mine works better." So mine, I've written mine and it works anyway. But he's the boss, so he won.
You know what? Arguing about poop just seems like a deeply important societal argument. So I
I
can
think
see.
it is. He's like, and I'm like, "Do you want it to be neutralized, or do you want to enrich it and make it like valuable and important?" He wanted it to be neutralized.
See, I think
So
that's. You know what? I think I would side with you. I teach I teach Latin, and my favorite thing to teach the students is that the Romans had people pay for the rights to clean out the public toilets because they would sell the human excrement as fertilizer.
yes, and well, it's interesting that both the Nawat and the Romans had sewer goddesses. That's one of the interesting like commonalities, that they had sewer goddesses. Anyway,
The most important goddess if you want your house to run properly, okay?
well, no, I think society really needs plumbing. And what do you think about the big stink and how the English did not have a really good plan for what to do with their sewer? They were not, their plumbing was not up to snuff, and how it almost destroyed the government. They were going to have to move parliament because of the state of the Thames, because they were just dumping all their feces into the river, which is not a good idea. Nobody likes that. Nobody. I
No.
mean, it was unbearable. So you have to think also, although I'm sure they didn't at the time, the rates, how that much that contributed to the rates of disease within the city, which in turn affects stability. So, um, anyway,
So
you have
this
to
actually
think.
is fantastic because it leads me into a question I had for you, which is so I find indigenous futurism fascinating because I'm a historian and I often feel really, I think, bound by what I know has already happened, if that makes sense. Like I imaginatively struggle to sort of break free of what I know is contained in the past. So when you're making something that is an indigenous futurist work, how do you break free, I guess, of the strictures of the society that you're living in? How do you look around at the technology that we have now and then maybe rethink how it would have developed in another culture? Because Coyote and Crow, I was fascinated because it obviously contains, and like even if, as you're talking about it, right, when you're doing some of the plumbing research, like you're taking real indigenous practices and folding them into the narrative. But also, this is a technical, a digital future as well. And so, how do you build that in an authentic way that has the rooting in indigenous culture that you're looking for?
Well, you just, I mean, to me, there's a lot. How do I put this? Well, the first, there are a couple of different questions that you asked. The first was, how do you break free from what you know did happen? And I think that's one of the things as an Indigenous person who grew up really traditionally, you know that what is reported to have happened and what did happen are very different. And that, well, like, there's a, okay, all right, let me, I'm going to go on my little pet
Do it. I'm
peeve
here for this.
here. Empire of the Summer Moon that is incredibly popular, and a lot of people have read it and think that it's historical or in some way accurate. As a Comanche person, my great grandmother, who was in my home when I came home from the, when I was a little toddler, she was Quanah Parker's youngest daughter, and that book is so wildly inaccurate, so wildly inaccurate. In not only its representation of our culture is factually wrong, like he doesn't even get buffalo butchering correct, and it's inaccurate in the events. Sol Ross did not kill Betanocona. He actually killed his valet, his Mexican valet. Betanocona died in Oklahoma several years later when Quanah was a teenager. So what we know happened is often not what happened. And growing up Native, I think you learn that really young. And also, you find out about lots of junctures where things could have gone differently. Like the fact that Buffalo Hump almost was the reason, basically, that Texas joined the U.S. And became a failed state. Was the Comanche leader Buffalo Hump, and whose name was not Buffalo Hump, but they didn't want to write down his real name because Comanche names, and we have a different standard of obscenity, let us say, and but he pretty much caused Texas to become part of the U.S. And so there are lots of weird little places in history where things could have gone differently. FDR at one time talked about, during the Dust Bowl, about returning Comancheria to the Comanches, which would have been large swaths of Oklahoma, Texas, and New Mexico to the Comanche Nation, because he thought it's never going to be worth anything again. So there are lots of weird little moments where things could have gone very differently. And it was Congress who were like, oh, absolutely not. But it was an idea that he floated as president. So I think growing up Native, you understand there are lots of, or really any marginalized group, you see the points where history could have gone differently. And that's the answer to the first question. I'm very wordy. So
you're a writer. It fits. It's good.
The other part is, for me, conjecture is easy. To go from, well, metal in the way that it's used by Europeans does not have much of a history with us. I mean, we did do some metal, like the Nawats, but they did not go for hardness. Rather than hardness, they went for ductility. And even the Spanish at that time, when they made contact, saw what they were able to do and were like, holy crap, we could never do anything like that. So it's not about being less than, it's about being different. And it's also about, but we have across nations, there's a lot of this history of ceramics. And then we thought about how ceramics are used today in the most cutting edge applications. So it was easy to kind of conjecture from there. Um, it seemed like the natural thing to do. And there's that. I would say that that's a good example of how that works. Um, and I mean, I do all kinds of writing. I mean, I say I do, I'm mostly write um, Indigenous futurism, but I do comic books. I have a novel coming out in October and a graphic novel coming out in this winter. So I do a lot of different kinds of. It's funny because it's one genre, but a lot of genres at the same time. Um, but yes, that's a thing. That's really. I mean, I think a lot of marginalized people have devoted a lot of mental space to what if, how things
Yeah.
could be different.
So when you're thinking about how things can be different and you're writing it, how do you you're so you've I know you've written several novels. You're a poet, and then now you've also contributed to Coyote and Crow. How did you find that writing for a game that someone would play and embody was different, if at all, from writing for someone to read in that more consumptive reading way?
Well, I there's less sex and violence. I put more of my own personal, in my own fiction. I tend to do that. I did. I mean, in the sense that there were some things that I wrote that we had to redact, and we were like, oh no, we need to take that out because it could be used abusively.
Right.
Um, I mean, that's real. The Muppets, who are one of the obstacles, they're the Bigfoot.
Yeah.
Um, they're a real being in our folklore. They're a real who are not just cannibals, but assault. Usually, men who smell bad,
Okay.
sexually assault men who smell bad, and so it's Comanche values the bad thing. The two worst vices are greed and poor hygiene in our book. So um and I think part of those both have to do with living in a small interdependent community. You're all relying on each other, so if one person's greedy, that's actually a threat to the whole. And
Hmm.
also, if one person has poor hygiene, that's kind of an affront to the whole too.
Yeah.
Um,
Everybody's got to live with it. So.
yeah, so we've all got to live with each other. So don't be greedy and don't and wash, please wash. So it's those are so we had to kind of remove that assault aspect from Muppets when I wrote it into the game
Hmm.
because it could be used in an abusive way, and we didn't want to see that happen.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Um, I also noticed that throughout Coyote and Crow, there are little sidebars that are, oh, if you're a native player, then this. If you're a non-native player, then that. How were those sidebars decided, and like what kinds of conversations went into writing this for an audience of players who might or might not understand Indigenous culture or be Indigenous themselves?
Well, this was from the beginning when we were working on it. I wrote the one in the very front of the book because we talked and talked and talked about this. because we want non-natives to play, but there's so much misrepresentation. I would say that in mainstream US society, the representation of natives is a misrepresentation, is a stereotype. And we didn't want to feed into that stereotype. We were like, okay, just forget about everything that you think you know, and just play the game as written. And that was the reason for that, was we didn't want, okay, my nightmare, Connor's nightmare, when we were discussing it, the nightmare is non-natives playing the game and going, ugh, me, want 'em, and doing the 1950s native talk while they were, or basing it on me, want 'em big, you too, whatever.
Yeah.
Um, and that was really the what we wanted to avoid. And people, without even trying to be jerks, without trying to be racist, if you go on what you think you know, you might miss some real learning opportunities about native cultures.
Yeah. I can see that.
So, I mean, like, one of the things, like, my tribe, historically, over and over and over again in the various literature, we're described as polygamous, but we are not polygamous. We're actually traditionally polyamorous. And when you marry someone, you also marry all their siblings, except we don't. They're same gender siblings, except we don't. But not necessarily. But also, like, they're, say you marry some guy and one of his brothers is, you would marry all his brothers and all his male cousins, because we don't recognize a difference between siblings and cousins.
So
They're the
basically, you
same.
marry the family.
His family, all the
Yeah.
men in his family, and he is also married to all the women in your family. And maybe your gay brother, is also his wife. So that's how our marriage system traditionally works, and all those people are considered equal parents to the children. So there are no unwanted children, there are no uncared for children, and also no unwanted and no uncared for elders. So it's really much more. I find that we tend to get really oversimplified. So if you think Coyote Crow is complicated, natives are that complicated.
I
We
mean, it
tend
makes sense though in the sense that, so I noticed from Coyote Crow, there's like a definite effort to emphasize, like, marriages don't have to be sexual, and these relationships take like a number of different forms. Would you say that those sorts of explanations spring out of marriage situations like the one you're talking about? I mean, I'm
oh
assuming that
yeah,
like you marry all the sisters because it means your family is going to take care of the other person's family
yeah,
forever.
yeah. But and it can be a sexual relationship, but it doesn't have to be.
Yeah.
And and people can leave marriages if they weren't. I mean, for our tribe, people left when they didn't want to be there anymore. So it was not compulsive, compulsory on either side. Um,
What
so
happens if you really hate your brother-in-law?
yeah, there are some stories. You just say no. You go, that's my bad husband, and um, so, but yeah, my great grandmother despised one of her brother-in-laws, and And there are stories about her doing all kinds of things to him. So yeah.
So actually, I do have a serious question about gender identity and sexuality. I really just don't know. So I think about this as a teacher, as somebody who runs a game club. You know, I have a lot of students who are non-binary. They identify
Yeah.
as non-binary, and explicitly says multiple times in Coyote and Crow that a non-native should not create a two-spirit character.
Oh,
Why
that's
is that?
it says there are all kinds of other gender options, but
Yes,
it's specifically the word two spirit.
got it.
Because two spirit is non-traditional. Two
Ooh.
spirit is not traditional. What happened was when colonization happened, the 19th century real wave of colonization that was deep, one of the ones that was deeply harmful, at least it happened in the 19th century with my nation and a lot of nations in Texas and Oklahoma, were missionaries. And they stomped out any hint of gender nonconformity, and they stomped out any hint of homosexuality, anything that was not strictly heteronormative for Native nations across the U.S. Now, some held on to part of their traditions, like there have all like homosexuality has always been really accepted among Comanches, and I know of many stories of what we would call trans people now and non-binary people now. However, as language was suppressed and anything that was not strictly heteronormative was suppressed, those words were lost.
Mm.
In the 70s and 80s, um, and gay and trans activists have always been really important to the push for Native rights, and they have always been at the forefront of the push for Native rights. And so in the 80s, I think it was in the early 80s, a group of Native uh, trans people and gay people from the US and Canada had a I can't remember. They had what they called the Native something something Congress, basically, and they sat down and talked about it. And they decided that the word that they wanted to use to reclaim all those lost words, to take the place of those words that had been completely lost because they were suppressed by boarding schools and missionaries, as well as governments, as well as the U.S. government. The word that they were going to use was going to be two spirit. So it was a hard won word coined by Native activists that is really inappropriate for a non Native person to use. And it's also just wrong. It wouldn't have exist. It wouldn't exist within this
Right.
context
Yeah.
because colonization. It's the result of colonization. It's a pushback against colonization. Since colonization didn't happen, there's no point in two spirit. You can be all kinds of other things. You have the whole rainbow of words to choose from, just not that one.
Yeah, see, I had no idea about this history, so this is super interesting. But also makes me go further, which is, you know, the thought of words that have been lost. I find upsetting as somebody who enjoys studying languages that nobody speaks anymore. And so, how do you preserve language um, in Indigenous communities in the United States? And how do we know like what words have been lost? Do words ever get rediscovered? Like, what is
Oh,
the
yes, words have been rediscovered in all kinds of interesting ways. But this is why Native nations all over the US and Canada, or particularly in the US, are pouring time and energy and money into reclaiming their languages because our languages were violently suppressed. Um, in fact, I was really lucky because my grandmother, um, well, her cousin, Dorothy Laurentino, was the very first native child, or she was the first Comanche child, but she was the first native child in Oklahoma not to go to boarding school because her parents used their superpower of hiring an attorney and sued the state for her to get to go to public school. And because of that, my grandmother and her closer siblings who were close to her in age um, got to go to public school and did not have their language suppressed. Um, but there were there were generations of kids before her who were not able to use their language. Interestingly, part of how language was, some of the people who were able to hold on to language um, were children who were deemed unfit to go to boarding school. So it was
Huh.
disabled children, disabled people who were summarily rejected as being suitable for boarding school, were able to keep the language and a lot of our traditions and customs because they didn't have to go to boarding school, so they didn't have their language and culture suppressed. Um, like there was a boy grew up to be a man, Baldwin Pewinofkett, who had epilepsy and so was not subject to boarding school, and he was able to carry on the language in his family. So there were a lot of people like that. Um, but now we're recovering words. Basically, there are huge archives. You know, at the library, I know Comanches who have gone to the Library of Congress with the Comanche Language Committee, who've gone to the Library of Congress, gone to the National Archives, where there's a treasure trove of interactions, words, hysterical letters from the government agents saying, you know, they didn't think we were ever going to get capitalism, that we were never going to, because we traditionally work on a gift economy. So the more power you want to have, the more you give away. You acquire goods in order to give them away. So the more you give, the higher your status, as opposed to the more you hoard. So it makes a really different cultural dynamic, let's say.
Oh, that's super interesting.
And so I
So,
worked that in. If you look, we have that. That's in the people, um, in the peoples of the freelance. There are people who function that way.
I like it. So speaking of people who function in different ways, so I know that people from multiple different tribes contributed to Coyote and Crow. So pieces of you and of your past and your family are in Coyote and Crow, but there are also going to be like footprints left by other people
Mhm.
with different backgrounds. How did y'all, I guess, work out together? Who would be represented where, and like what would be a fair representation? You know what I mean? Like how do you come to an agreement about that when you have a bunch of different people with different backgrounds who
Well,
are
we all had our jobs, and I think we all just did our individual specific jobs. And if the freelance have a Comanche flavor, then other things have, like Will Thompson worked on our language.
Will
Worked
Thompson,
on
like Winter Rabbit Will Thompson?
Will Thompson, Coyote and Crow. Will Thompson.
I think I know him. Will Thompson on Winter Rabbit. He did a game about gathering stuff for the winter. It was like based on folklore.
Oh, well, I don't know, but he developed the trade language,
Oh,
the
that's
language
awesome.
that is used. If it's the same Will Thompson, I don't know.
I'm gonna reach out and ask now. That's
Um,
awesome.
but I snuck in all the Comanche words that I could. I'll be honest. Originally, everything was in Comanche because I know my language pretty well. So everything in the central cultures was in Comanche, but it changed over. Will made it more fair. But the Yutu is still Comanche, and the movie Motai and is still in Comanche. The woolly mammoths, those are mine. Did do you know that part, the super intelligent woolly mammoths?
I do know about the super intelligent woolly mammoths. Yes.
I heard stories growing up about people having encounters with woolly mammoths. And they must be very old stories, but it stuck with me, and I was like, oh my God, I need to put woolly mammoths in this. And of course they write, because humans aren't capable of understanding because elephants sing. Do you know that elephants sing?
I didn't know that. I know they have very complex cultures that
they have
we fail to appreciate.
Exactly. Well, because elephants sing, and they sing at levels that we can't fully hear because of our poor little sad ears. And I thought, oh, well, how would they communicate with us? Oh, they draw too, so they'll just write. Of course, they hate us because sometimes we eat them. So that makes perfect sense. And then I went, oh gosh, they have the brown noise. They can make the brown noise, and that was. I was like, that would be a great joke.
Back to the plumbing.
Gosh, you'd think I was obsessed with something. Calling Dr. Freud. But yes, so I'm really proud of those guys. I thought they were good. And Yutsu is just rise up, fly in Comanche. Get up, rise up, fly. So that made the perfect sense for the name of that technology. And I don't know. I wanted to get more hand game into the stories, but we had a. This was a very funny thing. You know how sometimes people talk about being about different nations being divided by a common language. We had a moment of Connor and I were divided by a common language because I was trying to explain. I wanted to put more hand game in, but I didn't realize that the Tsalagi call it stick game.
Ooh, okay.
It's basically, this will sound really strange to you, but it's we Comanches we're serious game players. We are game playing people. We have a million games. We play them all the time. We have all this stuff. Well, hand game is one of our big wintertime sports, and it's an aggressive team version of button, who's got the button.
Okay.
So there are two teams, and each one has 4 sticks. But anyway, you're trying to find the two marked sticks that are being passed around in a big crowd while people sing and do different gestures. And sometimes they'll have like I would almost say a witch, but in the Terry Pratchett sense, whose job is to throw you off.
Okay.
to psychologically throw off the other team from choosing.
Some professional distractors and bluffers. I like it.
Yeah, exactly. And people wager money. It's still hang game is still going strong in native communities across the U.S. So I kind of wanted to get that more in. That's one of my few regrets, but I think we have a lot going on in there for people to do anyway.
Fair, but I would absolutely love to see this played now because I'm not a good enough bluffer to play myself, probably.
Well, you can look it up on YouTube. You can look it up, and you can go Native American hand game, and you can find people. They're wearing team jackets, and you'll be
That's
amazed.
fantastic.
It is fantastic. It is, Native cultures are very rich and complex and have all kinds of weird things that non-natives have no idea about. We're real cool. So we have
a whole culture of gamers can be nothing but. So
we're the oh my well, my great great grandmother Weyodi, who went to war alongside her husband. She left him in the reservation days and became a professional gambler, and supported herself as a professional gambler for the rest of her life. So we actually have one of our number systems is actually based on dice. We have two separate number systems, and one of them is based on dice.
So there's lots of different kinds of dice. So what kind of dice are these?
Like just a basic,
like a six-sided
dice, because that's what they had in the. I mean, that's what they got in the reservation days. Well, no, we have one based on money, one based on a six-sided dice, and one based on the fact that some women were told that they had to count everyone or no one was getting fed when we surrendered. So it was like 2 or 3 women walked around and figured out a numeric system and then counted to 1,000 and something so that everyone could get rations. So it's anyway, yeah.
Some good counting then, if everybody's gonna make it through.
Yeah, we kind of needed to do that. So yeah, numbers are a deal for us. And let's see, I don't know. Like the original name of the people up north that live underground were anacudas, which were ants. And I'm not sure I'll have to look it up what they changed the name to, but yeah, they were originally the ant people, and I sort of based them on that, and so they're all based on different thoughts I had.
I like it. So I have a sci-fi question for you. So I would actually consider myself a very recent sci-fi fan. Like I never really felt like sci-fi was for me until very recently, and I've only just started to really appreciate it and what it can be, which is how I found out about Afrofuturism and Indigenous futurism. But when you were, so I'm assuming because you write sci-fi, what was your early sci-fi reading experience like, and how long did it take you to connect the sci-fi that you were reading, that you were exposed to, with something that you could turn to your own purposes as a writer?
Oh, this is going to sound incredibly familiar and silly, but I was a little kid who loved Star Trek. Because Native people joined the military like crazy. So it was very familiar to me, the militaristic structure of Star Trek. But also, I just really loved it. And then it got moved to way past my bedtime. Boom. And in order to watch it, I had to get up at 11 o'clock, sneak into the living room, and, and watch it covertly with the volume down really low and my ear next to the speaker. And then I started writing my own episodes on the playground. But, and I think that's a common kid thing. If you don't have it, you're going to make your own. And then I also I was really late to start reading because I'm extremely dyslexic. I have like a lot of weird brain functions. I have epilepsy. I'm dyslexic. I have had some head trauma from my epilepsy, and so I'm partially blind. And so I was the first book I ever read from cover to cover was The Fellowship of the Rings, and then I read of the Ring, and then I read, The Two Towers and The Lord of the Rings. Those were the first three books I ever read. Um, and that was around the same time I had to go do my John Wayne crawl into the living room in order to watch Star Trek. And then I got caught, and so I started writing my own. And from there, I found a lot of fantasy really dull and repetitive. So I went to a lot of really like older science fiction, like Cordwainer Smith and C.M. Kornbluth was really a big favorite of mine. And that did seem doable to me. And although, no, I know when really as a profession writing science fiction came to me was in the foreword of a book by Harlan Ellison. He talked about the Kiowa writer Russell Bates and as a Kiowa science fiction writer. And I knew plenty of Kiowa people. In fact, it turned out I know his nieces, Russell Bates's nieces. But I was like, wow, this is actually possible. And so that was probably where I thought I could do it. That was when I went, yeah, I'm going to keep doing this. I'm going to veer towards science fiction, although I never gave up trying to write history for a long time. It was a long time before I gave up trying to write about what the stories I was told growing up.
So I want to press right there. You mentioned sort of that you originally wanted to write history. What made you feel that was something that you had to give up, and how do those things that you wanted to say come out in what you do now?
Well, I think that I was just shot down by every white academic person that I came in contact with for decades.
Oh God.
I mean, like just the veracity, and also at the same time, you have to understand that historians and different academics were coming to my family and interviewing my great grandmother. They were interviewing my grandmother, and then they would always say, "May I have a copy? Can you send me a copy when you're published?" And then they would read it, and they would go, this isn't what I said at all. And then when I would try to go, when I was later, I tried to express this to academics. There was a huge reaction against it. And I think a lot of it has to do with what I had to say and what I had to write was very, very much in opposition to what had been written in the past. And it's hard to admit that their original sources may have been flawed, for a lot of people. Maybe these white Texans who were fighting Comanches and never had a conversation with them were not experts in Comanches. But that's a real hard thing for a lot of historians to grapple with, let's say. And it's funny because I never argued that we were any less violent than we were. And it's never like, that's not the part that I take issue with. It's it's all the actual details of our culture the level of aggression and the, you know, how hard we were fighting to maintain ourselves, it's not something that I disagree with. It's the way we're depicted, our actual material culture. I don't know, our the actual details of what we did and how we did it and why. Um, so yeah, I mean, and also the representation of us as being somehow inferior or stupid or, well, I mean, for instance, after the Battle of Adobe Walls, as a Texan, you're probably familiar with this. Um,
I did have to take Texas history back in the 7th grade.
well, there's documentation on the Comanche side that two different men were gut shot at the Battle of Adobe Walls. Two different Comanche men, one Permasu, who and one Maisua, and that they were both gut shot. However, also at the Battle of Adobe Walls on the Comanche side was the Comanche physician, highly respected physician, Bakya, and Bakya under fire because Permasu was losing a lot of blood and was the most badly injured, resectioned Permasu's bowel under fire. The men gave up their water, a portion of their water rations to wash out his guts so that he could resection his bowel while they were being shot at. And Permasu actually went on to ride with Bass Reeves. He was the Comanche lawman who rode with Bass Reeves. And that, which is completely misrepresented by Taylor Sheridan. Completely. I mean, he was an elected official by the Comanche people. He was not less than. He was not a criminal. He was a highly respected person. It's horrible to see him represented that way. And Masua was less badly injured, and he was taken to a camp. He was able to be taken to a camp a little further, after Adobe Walls was over, and where Bakya resectioned his bowel also. They both men lived for decades afterwards.
That is impressive.
Yeah, I mean, there were no white surgeons doing that in the 1870s. So we weren't dumb. We had cataract surgery. We did stuff. So I like to think about, and this is the other part, is kind of projecting all this into the future. Is sort of what happened within Coyote Crow, is how how keeping someone's spirits up and keeping people laughing was considered part of the healing process. So that in Coyote Crow, in our hospitals, we have comedians, and that's the highest level that a comedian can attain. Is, oh yeah, I left my my stadium days behind. I only perform in the hospitals nowadays. That's what a big wheel I am, you know. So, and that's kind of a projection from hearing about these guys and how morale was considered. Hygiene and morale were really high on the order of the day for doctors. And this idea that that a man like Bakya was a medicine man and a superstitious, know nothing, compared to these guys who, you could not get to wash their hands. It's pretty insulting.
Yeah, no kidding.
So it's kind of anyway. That's something that I tried to project
Mhm.
into my writing on the game. Um, and the native interest in science. I mean, I've done some other. I sort of feel that in a way, science is the real reflection. The How do I put this? The awe of science, and awe of the awe, having feelings of deep love and awe towards science is not really separable from a deep awe and reverence for nature. If you revere nature, you revere science. It's all one thing. Um, and people thinking, or perhaps it being portrayed as though there's some kind of conflict there. That's a very European idea. Um, so I think that when I look at my ancestors, I think they just really loved science. They knew how things worked. They knew how things worked together. The natural world worked together. And so they were much better scientists than European scientists of their age, because they of the same era, because they were really looking at how ecosystems worked as a whole, how the body worked as a whole in relation as an animal because we're all animals in an ecosystem. So that they were, I think they were better scientists. And so I kind of, I mean, that's, of course, that's just my perspective, but that is my perspective, because they were able to live and not render things uninhabitable.
I mean, I really can't argue that. So honestly, like we could keep going a long time. But alas, we have to fit this into a podcast episode.
I
So
know I've been really all over the place. I'm
no, I
sorry.
love it though. No, this is awesome. But I do want to ask. So for people who want to pursue this further, what are some works of Indigenous futurism, your own and by others, that you would recommend that people explore?
Well, there's a Coyote Crow book out, Hemlock and Sage. That's a kind of a detective novel, set though in the Coyote Crow universe. There's Coyote Crow. There's Wolves, which is great. Have you read or have you played
No,
Wolves yet?
I have not.
Well, it is about gift economies and about survival and about how we have some screwy ideas about wolves, um, in mainstream US culture that are not right. We know that the alpha wolf thing isn't real, right? That's been proven that was a weird thing happening with wolves in captivity, and that in the wild they are just wolf packs are simply families, and the leaders of the pack are the parents of the pack. That's all it comes down to. It's just a family. And so, but wolves is actually about trying to feed your people, not starve, and help other groups survive. And if anyone starves, we all lose, because that really because if someone else is doing that badly, it makes everything unstable. So I strongly, I didn't play part in it, but it's a great game. So I would recommend that. I have a book, an Indigenous futurist book coming out from Android Press on October 8th of this year about, well, it is a futuristic, although it starts maybe 5 minutes in the future, novel about it's a retelling of the oral history of how we got horses, but set 5 minutes in the future.
Ooh.
Basically, a Comanche woman who is a scientist, an engineer. Actually, she's an aerospace engineer working on a joint public-private Mars venture. Gets very frustrated with her day-to-day life and the pressures that she and her family are under in this increasingly dystopian near future. And so she winds up stealing one of the Mars ships, and they become spacefaring people. She and her family become, she and her and 300 of her closest friends and family become spacefaring people.
Oh, that sounds good. I can't wait to read it, actually. I'm going to put that on the list of things to look for in the fall.
Yeah, it's called As Many Ships as Stars.
Oh, that's a great title, too. I'm excited.
Well, that's what we traditionally used to say about how many Comanches there were. That there were as many Comanches as there were stars in the sky. May have been a bit of an exaggeration, but, you know, it can be a goal.
And then, so what have you been playing? What have you been playing recently for fun?
I wish I had time to play lately. I wish. I'm actually working on some comics for Green Arrow.
Ooh.
And I've been working on that, and I have a couple of secret projects that I'm working on that should be come to the fore next year, maybe. But I have several. Oh, and and I've been working on getting everything just right for the graphic novel coming out next winter.
That's awesome.
So
that's awesome. I'll be looking forward to your secret projects. Although, you can just tell me now. I'm only media.
That's right. You're only on the internet. It's not like there's anyone else there.
No, it's a secret. And then if people do want to follow your work and find out about your secret project when it's ready to not be a secret anymore, where can you be found online?
I need to fix up my website, but I'm Weyodi.com. I can be found at Weyodi.com at my very, 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 my sadly in need of an update webpage.
You're just too busy writing. It's okay.
It's true. It is true. I have a lot on my plate. So yes, that's what I'm up to.
Fantastic. We'll be looking forward to it.
Thank you very much. I've had a great time.
Yeah, I was going to say, Weyodi, thank you so much. It's been a great conversation. I am super interested in what you're up to next, and we really, really appreciate the time. So for those of you who are out there, please like, subscribe, comment, ask questions, and most of all, happy gaming.